The morning sun peeked through the worn curtains of apartment 304 as Marcus Thompson rushed to get ready for school. The 15-year-old grabbed his backpack from the kitchen chair while his mother, Sarah, packed his lunch with careful hands. Their small two-bedroom apartment wasn't much, but it was home, filled with photos of their family and Marcus's academic awards. "Don't forget your science project," Sarah called out, her tired eyes showing the wear of working two jobs. She had just finished her night shift at the hospital, where she worked as a nurse's aide, but still made sure to see her son off to school every morning. Marcus grabbed the carefully constructed model of the solar system from their living room table. He had spent 3 nights working on it at his Uncle Ray's auto repair shop, using spare parts to make the planets look unique. The project was due today, and his science teacher, Mrs. Martinez, had already praised his creative idea during their last class. Outside their apartment building, Officer James Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping cold coffee while watching the entrance. He had been stationed in this neighborhood for 12 years, and in his mind, every person of color was a potential suspect. The anonymous tip he received last week about drug activity in the building had given him the excuse he'd been waiting for. As Marcus walked out of the building, Reynolds' eyes narrowed. The teenager's regular trips between home, school, and his uncle's shop had caught his attention. In Reynolds' twisted view, no black teenager could be just living a normal life. There had to be something illegal going on. "Target is on the move," Reynolds muttered into his radio, ignoring the fact that he was surveillance a minor without proper authorization. His partner, Officer Sarah Chen, had already expressed concerns about targeting Marcus, but Reynolds had dismissed her objections. Marcus walked to the bus stop, unaware of the police car watching him. He was thinking about the community center where he volunteered after school, helping younger kids with their homework. Today, he was supposed to help 10-year-old Tommy with his multiplication tables. The thought made him smile. Tommy reminded him of himself at that age, eager to learn but needing a little extra help. At Uncle Ray's auto repair, Ray Thompson was already preparing for his nephew's afternoon visit. He had cleared a small workspace where Marcus could do his homework before helping with simple car maintenance tasks. Ray had been teaching Marcus about cars since he was 12, hoping to give him both a useful skill and a safe place to spend his afternoons. "That cop car's been around here a lot lately," Ray mentioned to his assistant mechanic, Mike. "Keep an eye on Marcus when he comes in today. Something doesn't feel right." Back at the apartment, Sarah finally allowed herself to rest on their old couch. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Martinez. "Marcus's project is amazing. You should be proud." Sarah smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Her son was going places. He had already started talking about college, something no one in their family had done before. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds was building his case. He pulled out a folder filled with photos. Marcus walking to school, helping at the auto shop, entering the community center. In Reynolds' prejudiced mind, these innocent activities were evidence of something sinister. He ignored the fact that Marcus's school records showed him as an honor student, or that the community center director had written glowing reports about his volunteer work. "I'm telling you, there's something going on with that kid," Reynolds insisted to his partner later that day. Officer Chen shook her head, frustrated by her partner's obsession. "James, he's just a teenager who goes to school and helps at his uncle's shop," Chen argued. "We're wasting resources watching him." But Reynolds wasn't listening. He was already drafting a request for a search warrant, twisting the normal activities of a black teenager into suspicious behavior. In his 20 years on the force, no one had successfully challenged his methods, protected by a system that too often looked the other way. As the day ended, Marcus finished his homework at Uncle Ray's shop, proud of the A+ he received on his science project. He had no idea that his normal, peaceful life was about to be shattered by one officer's prejudice and abuse of power. The shadows of what was to come were gathering, even as he walked home under the setting sun, thinking about tomorrow's math test and the kids he would help at the community center. Officer Reynolds sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by photos of Marcus pinned to a large corkboard. His obsession had grown stronger over the past week. Every afternoon, he watched the teenager's routine. School to community center to auto shop, then home. In Reynolds' mind, each location was a potential drug drop point. "I got something," Reynolds announced as Officer Chen walked in. He pointed to a photo of Marcus carrying a paper bag into his uncle's shop. Look at this. What do you think is in that bag? Chen sighed heavily. Is lunch? School books? James, you're seeing things that aren't there. But Reynolds wasn't listening. He pulled out a map of the neighborhood and started marking X's at each place Marcus visited regularly. The community center, the auto shop, the bus stop. In his prejudiced mind, it all formed a pattern. At the community center, Marcus was helping Tommy with his homework, unaware of the growing threat to his freedom. The young boy had finally mastered his multiplication tables, and Marcus felt proud of their progress. Marcus, you're really good at teaching, Miss Wilson, the center's director, said as she watched them work. Have you thought about becoming a teacher yourself? Marcus smiled, considering the idea. Maybe. I just like helping people understand things better. Meanwhile, Uncle Ray had noticed the increasing police presence around his shop. He watched through the windows as Reynolds' patrol car drove by for the third time that day. The sight made his stomach turn. He had seen this kind of targeting before. Mike, Ray called to his assistant. When Marcus comes in today, make sure you walk him to the bus stop afterward. That cop's getting too interested in my nephew. At school, Marcus was excelling in his classes. Mrs. Martinez had put his solar system project on display in the science lab, and other teachers were taking notice of his hard work. But even here, Reynolds' shadow was beginning to reach. The officer had started questioning school staff about Marcus, twisting innocent questions into suspicious interrogations. Does he ever receive strange packages? Have you noticed him talking to older students? Any unexplained absences? The school principal, Dr. Roberts, was troubled by these questions. She had known Marcus since he started high school and recognized Reynolds' behavior for what it was, racial profiling. After the officer left, she called Sarah Thompson to warn her. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that an officer has been asking questions about Marcus, she explained carefully. Your son is an excellent student, and we stand behind him completely. Sarah felt her heart race at this news. As a black mother in America, she had always feared this day might come. That evening, she sat Marcus down for the talk that every black parent dreads. Baby, I need you to be extra careful, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. If the police stop you, keep your hands visible. Don't argue, don't run, just call me or Uncle Ray right away. Marcus nodded, but confusion showed on his young face. Mom, I haven't done anything wrong. I know, baby, I know. Back at the police station, Reynolds was preparing his case. He had taken the anonymous tip about drug activity and built an elaborate fantasy around it, with Marcus at the center. His supervisor, Captain Brooks, barely glanced at the file before signing off on increased surveillance. Just don't make it too obvious, Brooks warned, more concerned about department image than proper procedure. That night, as Marcus slept peacefully in his bed, Reynolds sat in his car outside the apartment building, his mind filled with prejudice and false suspicions. The officer's obsession had reached a dangerous point, and he was ready to move forward with his plan. In the quiet hours before dawn, he began typing up a request for a search warrant, turning innocent moments into suspicious activities, twisting a young man's promising life into something sinister. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change many lives forever. Sunday morning arrived with a gentle peace. Sarah Thompson stood in their small kitchen, humming a gospel song while preparing breakfast. Marcus sat at the table in his church clothes, reading a book for his English class. The smell of pancakes filled their apartment as sunlight streamed through the windows. Neither of them knew that outside, Officer Reynolds was gathering his tactical team. Remember, this is a high-risk drug raid, Reynolds briefed his team, ignoring Officer Chen's concerned looks. Subject is likely armed and dangerous. He didn't mention that his subject was a 15-year-old honor student with no criminal record. At 8:45 a.m., Sarah was just placing a plate of pancakes in front of Marcus when they heard it, the thunderous sound of boots rushing up the stairs. Police! Search warrant! The shout came just seconds before their front door exploded inward. Marcus dropped his fork as armed officers in black tactical gear stormed into their home. Sarah screamed, instinctively moving to shield her son. The peaceful Sunday morning shattered into chaos. On the ground! Now! Reynolds shouted, his rifle pointed at the mother and son. Sarah raised her trembling hands, her voice shaking as she tried to protect her child. Please, my son. He's just a boy, she pleaded, slowly getting down on her knees. Marcus followed, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The officers swarmed through their home like angry hornets. They tipped over furniture, pulled books from shelves, and dumped drawers onto the floor. Marcus's science project crashed to the ground, planets scattering across the carpet. "Where are the drugs?" Reynolds demanded, standing over Marcus. "We know you're dealing. Make this easier on yourself and tell us where they are." Marcus could barely speak through his terror. I don't have any drugs. I don't do drugs." Sarah tried to reach for her son's hand, but an officer roughly pulled her away. "Please, check his school records. Call his teachers. He's a good boy." Reynolds ignored her pleas. He stormed into Marcus's bedroom, ripping posters from walls and slashing open his mattress. College brochures and homework assignments littered the floor. In the kitchen, other officers broke dishes and emptied food containers, searching for drugs that didn't exist. Officer Chen stood back, watching the scene with growing horror. This wasn't law enforcement, it was harassment. She saw Marcus's perfect attendance certificates trampled under heavy boots, saw Sarah's nursing textbooks thrown carelessly aside. "James, there's nothing here." Chen finally spoke up. "These people were getting ready for church." Reynolds spun around, his face red with anger and frustration. "Keep searching. They must have hidden it well. Check the walls, the floorboards." The raid continued for 2 horrifying hours. Marcus and Sarah remained on their knees, watching helplessly as their home was destroyed. Neighbors gathered in the hallway, recording the scene on their phones. Some called local news stations. Finally, after finding nothing illegal, Reynolds had to admit defeat, but he couldn't let go of his prejudiced beliefs. "We'll be watching you," he threatened Marcus as he prepared to leave. "One slip-up, that's all we need." As the tactical team filed out, Officer Chen lingered behind. She looked at the devastation around her, the broken door, the destroyed furniture, the scattered belongings. More importantly, she saw the psychological damage. Marcus trembling uncontrollably, Sarah's tears flowing freely, both of them still kneeling on their floor surrounded by the ruins of their Sunday morning. "I'm sorry," Chen whispered, but the words felt hollow even to her. After the officers left, Sarah and Marcus remained frozen for several minutes, afraid to move. Their peaceful home had been violated, their sense of safety shattered. Through their broken door, they could hear neighbors discussing what happened, phones ringing, voices raised in anger. Marcus finally spoke, his voice small and frightened. "Mom, why did they do this to us?" Sarah pulled her son close, her tears falling into his hair. She had no answer that could make sense of such senseless cruelty. Their Sunday clothes were dirty from kneeling on the floor, their breakfast cold and scattered, their home in shambles. But they were alive, and in that moment, Sarah knew this was just the beginning of their fight for justice. The day after the raid, news cameras gathered outside the Thompsons' apartment building. Sarah sat on their patched-up couch, surrounded by neighbors who had come to help clean up the mess. Her hands shook as she tried to drink from a paper cup of water. "They destroyed everything," Mrs. Rodriguez from next door whispered to another neighbor as she picked up pieces of Marcus's broken science project. The planets that had earned him an A+ now lay cracked and scattered across the floor. Marcus hadn't spoken much since yesterday. He sat in the corner of his room, jumping at every loud noise. His Uncle Ray had taken the day off from the auto shop to be with them, and he watched his nephew with worried eyes. "Sarah," Ray said softly, "I called that civil rights lawyer my friend recommended. She wants to meet with us today." Before Sarah could answer, there was a knock at their temporary door. It was Dr. Roberts, Marcus's school principal, carrying a thick folder of documents. "I brought all of Marcus's school records," she announced, her voice firm with determination. "Perfect attendance, honor roll, volunteer work. Everything that proves what kind of student he is. That officer had no right to do this." The local news was already running the story. Cell phone videos taken by neighbors showed the violent entry, the armed officers storming in while Marcus and Sarah were having breakfast. The community center where Marcus volunteered had called, offering support and witness statements about his character. "Marcus," Miss Wilson from the center had said on the phone, "all the kids are asking about you. Tommy says he's saving his math problems for when you come back." But Marcus wasn't sure when he'd feel safe leaving the apartment again. Every time he looked at their broken front door, he remembered the terror of guns pointed at him and his mother. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. In the afternoon, the civil rights lawyer, Ms. Jackson, arrived. She sat with the family at their kitchen table, which still showed scuff marks from the officers' boots. What they did was wrong on so many levels, Ms. Jackson explained, taking detailed notes. The warrant was based on nothing but racial profiling. We're going to fight this. As she spoke, more community members arrived. The local pastor brought food. Marcus's teachers sent messages of support. Even Officer Chen had quietly reached out, offering to testify about Reynolds' obsessive behavior leading up to the raid. Your son's record is perfect, Ms. Jackson continued, reviewing the school documents. Honor student, community volunteer, no disciplinary issues ever. We can prove this was targeted harassment. Sarah nodded, finding her voice growing stronger. They tried to destroy us, but they don't know how strong we are. That evening, as the sun set over their neighborhood, something remarkable happened. People began gathering outside their building. Students from Marcus's school, kids from the community center and their parents, mechanics from Uncle Ray's shop, they all came with candles and signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "Stop Police Harassment." Marcus watched from his window as the crowd grew. For the first time since the raid, he felt something besides fear. He felt hope. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we go down there?" Sarah took her son's hand, and together they walked downstairs. The crowd cheered when they appeared. Tommy, Marcus's young math student, ran up and hugged him. "We're not letting them bully you," Tommy said firmly. "You're my tutor, and I need you." As night fell, the candlelight vigil grew larger. Local civil rights leaders arrived, promising support. News cameras captured the scene, not just a protest, but of community love and solidarity. Back in their apartment later, Sarah watched Marcus finally fall asleep on the couch, too afraid to return to his destroyed room. She covered him with a blanket and whispered, "We're going to fight this, baby, and we're not fighting alone." The raid had tried to break them, but instead, it had revealed the strength of their community. Tomorrow, they would begin their battle for justice, supported by hundreds of neighbors who refused to let hatred win. Detective Maria Suarez sat at her desk in the Internal Affairs office, surrounded by stacks of files. She had been assigned to investigate the Thompson raid after the public outcry, and what she found disturbed her deeply. "This can't be right," she muttered, reviewing Officer Reynolds' warrant application. The anonymous tip that started everything had come from a phone number that no longer worked. When she tried to trace it, she found it had been disconnected months ago. In another part of the station, Officer Chen finally gathered her courage. She walked into Internal Affairs with a thick folder under her arm, her heart pounding. "Detective Suarez?" Chen said quietly, "There's something you need to see about Officer Reynolds." Suarez looked up from her desk, immediately noticing Chen's nervous energy. "Come in, officer." Close the door. Chen placed her folder on the desk. Inside were photos, notes, and reports documenting Reynolds' obsessive surveillance of Marcus. "He wouldn't listen when I told him the kid was innocent. He just kept watching him, every day, making up stories about what he thought was happening." While this meeting took place, Marcus was trying his first day back at school. Students and teachers formed a protective circle around him, but he still jumped at every loud noise. In his first class, when someone dropped a book, he nearly fell out of his chair. Mrs. Martinez stayed close to him during science class. "You don't have to present today if you don't feel ready," she said gently, but Marcus shook his head. "I want things to be normal again," he replied, even though his hands trembled as he held his notes. Back at Internal Affairs, Detective Suarez was making shocking discoveries. Reynolds had a history of complaints, all filed by people of color, all mysteriously dismissed without investigation. She found at least 5 other raids, all based on anonymous tips, all targeting Black or Hispanic families, and all coming up empty. How did nobody catch this before? She wondered aloud, spreading the cases across her desk. The pieces started coming together when she interviewed Reynolds' former partner from 3 years ago. The older officer spoke quietly, ashamed of his silence. Reynolds would plant those anonymous tips himself, he admitted. He used burner phones, call them in, then throw the phones away. "I knew it was wrong, but I never reported it." Meanwhile, Sarah Thompson was meeting with Ms. Jackson, their civil rights lawyer, in her office. The lawyer had discovered something important in the warrant paperwork. "Look at this." Ms. Jackson pointed to a document. Reynolds claimed he had evidence of drug sales, but the dates he listed. Marcus was giving a presentation at the school board meeting that night. "We have video proof." Sarah felt tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of anger rather than fear. "He tried to destroy my son's life with lies." That afternoon, Detective Suarez called Captain Brooks into her office. She laid out everything she had found: the fake tips, the history of targeting minorities, the falsified evidence. "Sir, this goes beyond one bad raid," she explained firmly. "Officer Reynolds has been conducting a personal campaign of harassment against people of color. And somewhere along the line, people in this department chose to look the other way." Brooks looked uncomfortable as he reviewed the files. Other officers had gathered outside Suarez's office, watching through the glass windows. Jen stood among them, her head held high. At the community center, Marcus had returned to tutoring Tommy. The young boy didn't treat him any differently, just pushed his math homework across the table like always. "I told all my friends you're the bravest person I know," Tommy said simply, making Marcus smile for the first time in days. Detective Suarez worked late into the evening, building an airtight case. On her wall, she had created a timeline showing years of Reynolds' misconduct. But more importantly, it showed years of systemic failure, other officers who stayed quiet, supervisors who ignored complaints, a department that let prejudice flourish in the dark. This time, she promised herself, looking at a photo of Marcus and his mother. This time it ends differently. The community center's meeting room was packed. Sarah Thompson stood at the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. 2 weeks had passed since the raid, and she had discovered she wasn't alone in her fight. "My son was targeted because of the color of his skin," she said, looking at the faces before her. "But today, I'd met 6 other families who went through the same thing. Officer Reynolds hurt all of us, and the system let him do it." In the audience, Marcus sat between Uncle Ray and Tommy's mother, Mrs. Parker. Other families were there too: the Rodriguezes, whose home was raided last year; the Jacksons, whose teenage daughter was stopped and searched on her way to band practice; the Williams family, whose father was wrongly arrested while walking home from work. "We need to make sure this never happens to another child," Sarah continued. Her words were met with strong applause and nods of agreement. At the back of the room, local news cameras rolled. The story had grown bigger than just one raid. It had become about years of unchecked police misconduct and racial profiling in their community. Ms. Jackson, their lawyer, stepped up next. She had helped form a new organization called Citizens for Police Accountability with Sarah and the other affected families. "We have evidence of at least 20 similar cases," Ms. Jackson explained, showing documents on a projector screen. Each time, Officer Reynolds claimed he had an anonymous tip. Each time, he targeted people of color. And each time, he found nothing illegal. The meeting shifted into action planning. People signed up for committees, volunteered to speak at city council meetings, and planned peaceful protests. Marcus watched in amazement as his mother became a leader in the movement. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Chen was facing backlash for speaking out. Some officers wouldn't look at her in the hallways. Others whispered when she passed. But she held her head high, knowing she had done the right thing. "You're brave," Detective Suarez told her during a private meeting. "We need more officers willing to stand up against wrongdoing." That afternoon, Marcus did something unexpected. He asked to speak at the next city council meeting. Sarah was worried, but she saw the determination in her son's eyes. "Are you sure about this, baby?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "People need to hear from someone it happened to, someone young like me." The next week, Marcus stood before the city council. His voice shook at first, but grew stronger as he spoke. "I used to want to be a police officer when I grew up," he said, looking directly at the council members. "I wanted to help people and make my community safer. But how can we feel safe when the people meant to protect us are the ones we fear?" His words hit hard. Even the council members who usually defended the police department looked uncomfortable. In the audience, Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son's courage. The movement grew stronger each day. Other police officers, inspired by Chen's example, began coming forward with their own stories of witnessing misconduct. The local newspaper ran a series of articles examining racial bias in police stops and searches. Uncle Ray organized a group of local business owners to support the cause. They put up signs in their windows reading, "Stop racial profiling," and "Justice for our community." The auto shop became a meeting place for activists and families. Tommy and his friends from the community center started their own campaign, making videos about their experiences with police that went viral on social media. "Kids Against Racism" became their slogan, and their young voices added powerful testimony to the cause. Sarah looked at everything happening around her with a mixture of pride and determination. The raid had been meant to break them, but instead it had awakened something powerful, a community united in the fight for justice. "They thought they could silence us," she told Marcus that evening. "But our voice is louder than ever." The police department's hearing room was silent as Detective Suarez presented her findings. Officer Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair, his face red with anger. Behind him, the room was packed with community members, reporters, and other police officers. "Over the past 8 years," Suarez explained, pointing to a screen showing her evidence, Officer Reynolds conducted 32 raids based on anonymous tips. Every single one targeted minorities. Every single one found no evidence of crimes. She played audio recordings from Reynolds' former partners, each describing his racist comments and illegal actions. Then she showed phone records proving he had made the anonymous tips himself. "He bought burner phones," Suarez continued, her voice firm. "He called in fake tips about his chosen targets. Then he threw the phones away. This wasn't police work, it was harassment." Officer Chen testified next, describing Reynolds' obsession with Marcus. She showed the photos Reynolds had taken, the maps he had marked, and the false reports he had written. "He watched a 15-year-old honor student for weeks," Chen said. "He turned normal activities like going to school and helping at his uncle's shop into suspicious behavior. He didn't want evidence, he wanted a target." Reynolds shifted in his seat, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear, but the evidence kept coming. Dr. Roberts, Marcus's school principal, presented records showing that Marcus was at school board meetings and volunteer activities during times Reynolds claimed he was selling drugs. This young man was giving speeches about education funding, while Officer Reynolds was writing reports claiming he was dealing drugs. Dr. Roberts stated, her voice shaking with controlled anger. The disciplinary board members looked increasingly troubled as more evidence emerged. Captain Brooks, who had approved the raid, looked down at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Sarah and Marcus sat in the front row, holding hands. Behind them, Tommy and other kids from the community center held up signs reading "Police should protect, not harass, and Black children matter." Ms. Jackson, their lawyer, presented next. She showed videos from all of Reynolds' raids, including the one on the Thompson home. The room grew tense as they watched armed officers storm into homes, frightening children and destroying property. "This officer didn't make mistakes," Ms. Jackson argued. "He deliberately targeted families of color. He created fake evidence. He abused his power. And until now, the system protected him." Reynolds finally spoke, trying to defend himself, but his words only made things worse. "I was doing my job," he insisted. "These neighborhoods, these people." "These people?" Detective Suarez interrupted. "You mean honor students? Healthcare workers? Small business owners? Or do you just mean people who don't look like you?" The evidence was overwhelming. The disciplinary board took only an hour to reach their decision. When they returned, the head of the board looked directly at Reynolds. "Officer James Reynolds, you have violated your oath to protect and serve. You have engaged in racial profiling, falsified evidence, and abused your authority. You are immediately terminated from the police force. Furthermore, we are recommending criminal charges for your actions." A cheer went up from the community members present. Sarah hugged Marcus, tears streaming down her face. Officer Chen smiled quietly, knowing she had helped bring truth to light. But the board wasn't finished. They announced new department-wide reforms: mandatory bias training, civilian oversight committees, body camera requirements, and strict new rules about raid procedures. "This case has shown us that one bad officer isn't the only problem," the board head stated. "We need to change the system that allowed this to happen." As they left the hearing room, Marcus felt lighter somehow. The fear that had followed him since the raid began to lift. Outside, reporters waited to interview his mother, who had become a respected voice for police reform. "Mom," Marcus said quietly as they walked through the crowd, "do you think things will really change now?" Sarah looked at her son, at the supporters around them, at Officer Chen talking with Detective Suarez, at the new police chief already implementing reforms. "Change is already happening, baby," she replied. "And we helped make it happen." 6 months had passed since the hearing. The Thompsons' apartment looked different now. New furniture, fresh paint, and a stronger door. But the biggest changes weren't in the physical space, they were in the people themselves. Marcus stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie. A letter from the Civil Rights Scholarship Foundation lay on his desk, offering him a full college scholarship. Next to it was a photo of him speaking at the governor's conference on police reform. "You ready?" Sarah called from the living room. She was dressed for a special ceremony at City Hall, where she would be appointed to the new Police Oversight Committee. The organization she helped create, Citizens for Police Accountability, had grown into a powerful voice for change. "Almost," Marcus replied, smiling at his reflection. The scared boy from 6 months ago was gone. In his place stood a confident young man who had found his voice and his purpose. At the community center, things had changed too. A new program called Youth and Police Dialogue brought officers and teenagers together for honest conversations about race, fear, and trust. Marcus led many of these sessions, sharing his story and helping build bridges. Tommy, now excelling in math thanks to Marcus's continued tutoring, had started a school club called Kids for Justice. They made videos about community relations and organized workshops about knowing your rights. "You're still my favorite teacher," Tommy told Marcus during their last tutoring session of the year. "Even if you're going to be super busy with all your new stuff." Officer Chen had been promoted to sergeant and now headed the department's new community relations unit. She worked closely with Sarah's organization, making sure other officers learned from past mistakes. "We're training officers differently now," Chen explained during the community meeting. "It's not just about enforcing laws, it's about understanding and protecting all members of our community." Detective Suarez's investigation had led to more changes. The department now required extensive documentation for raids, with multiple levels of review. Anonymous tips had to be thoroughly verified before any action could be taken. Uncle Ray's auto shop had become a symbol of community solidarity. He hired local youth for after-school jobs, teaching them skills while keeping them safe. The Stop Racial Profiling sign still hung in his window, but now it was joined by awards for community service. Reynolds faced criminal charges for his actions. His trial was set for next month, with many of his victims prepared to testify. But for Marcus and his mother, that was no longer the most important part of their story. "We turned pain into power," Sarah often said at community meetings. "We turned fear into change." The apartment still held memories of that terrible Sunday morning, but they were overshadowed by newer, stronger memories. The candlelight vigil, the community meetings, the victories large and small that followed. Marcus kept his broken science project planets on a shelf in his room. "They remind me that broken things can lead to better things," he explained to visitors. Next to them sat his acceptance letter to a summer program in law and social justice. That evening, as Marcus and Sarah headed to the City Hall ceremony, they passed Officer Chen talking with a group of rookie officers outside the community center. "Remember," they heard her say, "the badge means we serve everyone. Every single person in this community deserves respect and protection." Inside City Hall, the mayor presented Sarah with her appointment to the Oversight Committee. The audience included faces both familiar and new. Dr. Roberts beaming proudly, Tommy and his friends holding congratulatory signs, Ms. Jackson wiping away happy tears. "Mom," Marcus whispered as they left the ceremony, "remember when you said change was happening? You were right." Sarah squeezed her son's hand. The path ahead still held challenges, but they would face them together, supported by a community that had learned to stand up, speak out, and work for change. Later that night, Marcus stood at his window, looking out at his neighborhood. Police cars still patrolled the streets, but something was different now. The fear was gone, replaced by determination and hope. "We didn't just survive," he thought, touching the scholarship letter in his pocket. We helped make things better.